right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Bob's Lunch Break. I'm Bobtheorc, and I am going to take a quick break before I go to the office. I spent an exciting morning doing paperwork and invoicing. Yay, paperwork and invoicing. I hate paperwork, but now I'm going to drink a cup of tea. I'm going to hang out with you guys. We'll talk a little bit about economics, America's economics future, and I'll talk about how I'm going to prepare for it and some things that you can do too. But first, the Bob the Oak Show. This is purely a work of fiction, and for entertainment purposes only. Any resemblance to real-world people or events is purely coincidental. I'm just doing this for fun, so take everything I say with a grain of salt. All right, here I am in my space station before I go to work. A cup of tea. Hey, Shadow Wolf, how's it going? I see you in chat. Thanks for joining. And I had a couple thoughts before I head into the office. We're gonna have a sales meeting this afternoon, where I'm hoping to bring on a new sales rep to help sell some of the business services that we do. Now that the economy's starting to turn around. At least it feels like it's turning around, but is it? I mean, on the surface, things are looking pretty good, but there's some deep underlying problems. I'm glad you're doing good, Shadow Wolf. I'm glad you're doing good. And so I want to share some of my thoughts about what I think is going to happen and how I'm preparing for the future, and then maybe you guys can find this inspiring to do something yourself as well. So, first off, I do think the economy is getting better. We're past all the COVID bullshit. And we're still spending way too much money. Government's still spending a lot of money. There does seem to be some business optimism, whether justly or not. Trump being in office does make businesses more optimistic about investing in the future, especially after his Mideast trip, where he got all these trillions of dollars of potential investment. Anywhere from $1 to $10 trillion, depending on how much you believe is going to happen. One thing I want to mention though is that a lot of these investments, they're going to be good for the economy overall, but they're not going to really help you or me. It's like when Qatar's talking about buying 100 Boeing jets, that's going to help Boeing. It's going to help all like the big donor class, and that'll have some trickle-down effect that we'll see. But that's not going to be direct money in my pocket. It's not going to be direct money in your pocket. The tariff war that seems to be having, I think that's more of a negotiation ploy. I don't think it's going to be that bad. There's been a big trade imbalance for a long time. It's something we have to deal with. And buying cheap plastic crap from China is cheap, but beyond a certain point, when you ship all of your jobs overseas, that takes away money out of the working man's pocket. Factory jobs are good paying jobs where people can make 25, 30, 50 bucks an hour. And and there have been some reports of some of the smaller manufacturing companies seeing some benefit as some of the manufacturing is slowly coming back to America, or to where, because the foreign prices that are artificially low because of cheap labor and government manipulates their currency, they subsidize their businesses to give their businesses an advantage over the American markets. So that's helping. Like I heard Whirlpool's doing really well. I mean, who still has a Whirlpool washing machine? Actually, I think I have a GE washing machine now. That I still have the GE microwave that I got in college back in the 90s. I think still works. The one here in my workshop. The one in the kitchen, that one's a cheap Walmart microwave. I have to replace it every year or two. But we're going to see some long-term benefit, although there's going to be some short-term pain, but it's not going to be as bad as people think. I don't think it's going to be that awful. I do think that there is sort of the big elephant in the room that nobody's paying attention to. And long term, it's going to be our debt, and that's going to be a big problem. Short term, all these are just kind of little things that we've got enough momentum in the economy. We're going to blow through it. I know that with my business, it's still soft. It's not back to 2019 levels. The retail's doing all right, uh, but the corporate work is not back to where it was at 2019 levels. I made more money in 2019 than probably just about any other time in my life. And even 2020 wasn't that bad, but 2021 sucked. Oh my God, I lost so much money in 2021. It sucked. Nobody was buying anything. The retail was doing all right. For those of you who don't know, I own a computer company here in Oklahoma, and I do consulting work as well. The retail store generally does well when the economy's bad because people need their computer fixed. But my consulting business generally has big ups and downs. My consulting stuff was doing great back in 2018, 2019. I was making pretty good money, and then last few years, not so much, because people don't want to take a lot of risks when the economy's weak, and about half the economy is psychological. A lot of people don't realize that. A lot of it is psychological. If I think it's going to be okay and you think it's going to be okay and we're all spending money, that money circulates back and forth. And, if I have $1 in my pocket and I buy something from you, then you then take that dollar and buy something from somebody else, and they buy from somebody else, and so on and so on. That dollar may have, I don't remember what my dad called it, there's some economic word for it, but basically that dollar can get spent like 10 times, and it'll have an economic effect of about $10. Whereas if we perceive the economy's bad and I'm saving that dollar, then that dollar has an economic effect of basically nothing. Or if I spend it on you and then you save it, it has an economic effect of about $1. So the economy can greatly expand or contract depending on how people perceive psychologically that it's doing. And a lot of people don't realize that. Now, there's a couple of big things that are going on that happened it's been happening. Some of it happened very recently. Some of it happened, been happening for a long time. So the big problem is the U.S. has a gigantic debt. It's like 30-something trillion dollars, like $36 trillion. And this just keeps on getting bigger and bigger because the government keeps spending money. You have corrupt Democrats that spend lots of money that we don't have to enrich their friends. And on the other side, you have corrupt Republicans who spend lots of government money to enrich their friends. And both sides kind of suck. And if you look at the spending bills, Elon Musk, when he was doing his Doge thing, whether you believe him or not, he claimed that something like 10 to 25% of the government's budget was just fraud and waste, which is probably true, actually, because in most large organizations, probably 10 to 25% is probably fraud or waste. I mean, the American government is largely a big money laundering scheme. Look at all the money we're throwing to Ukraine, which is largely a big money laundering scheme. Most foreign aid is a large money laundering scheme. Probably at least 10% of Social Security and Medicare is probably fraud, or probably more than that. Whenever you have the government guaranteeing money, then hospitals and big pharma can start just charging more. Why do we pay 10 times as much for medication here in America than they do in developed countries in Europe? Well, because the government's paying for it. We don't care what the price is because our insurance is paying for it. The Medicare is paying for it, and that's why our insurance is so high. But if Big Daddy government's paying the bill, and then they're just printing more money to cover the tab because they're not taxing enough to, if they taxed us enough to pay the bills, we'd have a revolution because Americans don't like paying taxes. We don't want to pay European-style taxes. And if they taxed us that much, if we were paying 40, 50, 60% in taxes, the government would still find a way to spend all the extra money anyway. And so they print it, which generally causes inflation. Now, the reason we haven't had lots of inflation in recent years is back in like the 70s, they made 70s, 80s, they made a deal with Saudi Arabia that all the oil transactions would be done in U.S. dollars. This forced everybody else to buy U.S. dollars. And so, remember, price is largely a supply and demand. You know, if there's a high demand for the dollar is going to maintain a high value. But under Biden, we lost that deal. Now Saudi will do business in a variety of currencies because, you know, the frankly, because the Biden and the King of Saudi Arabia don't like each other, and they pissed each other off. And you know, I think Biden screwing that up will probably be the worst thing that he did that nobody realizes until, you know, probably decades down the line, because it'll be a sort of a filtering down effect. It'll take some time for this to happen. But you know, now you have Saudi Arabia being courted by BRICS, which is a competing economic group. It's larger than the, you know, than the European, than the G12 or G7 or whatever, however many Gs there are. Uh, you know, Russia, China, India. That's a lot of people. I mean, just India and China alone is like half the planet, third of the planet. So what's going to happen is there's not as much of a demand for the U.S. dollar, but you still have a big supply but a lower demand, which means that the value of the dollar is going to drop. And you can see this if you compare currencies. So one of the things that I like to do on a pretty regular basis is I like to compare the US dollar to the Russian ruble. And the reason I do the ruble is because, so first off, they're largely detached. You know, we're decoupled from the Russian economy. They're what we do and what the Russians do don't really affect each other because we're largely decoupled. With China, even though they're a competing interest, we're still kind of meshed together. So, you know, we're not, we can influence each other. And China does a lot of funny business in order to keep the value of their currency low to keep getting the trade. Whereas Russia, they're not, you know, they're a hard currency. They're largely backed in gold and commodities, you know, various basket of commodities is my understanding. Um, and so over the years, you know, traditionally Russian, there'd be about 90 to 100 rubles per dollar, and now there's only about 80 Russian rubles per dollar. Sometimes it drops a little bit lower. It's gone as low as 60. It's been as high as like 120 at the very start of the Ukraine war when we did all those sanctions, and that kind of hurt their economy a little bit. But the value of the dollar has been slowly dropping compared to the Russian ruble. And the reason I don't compare it to the euro is because the European economy is screwed worse than ours, right? And so we're trying to, so I want to compare the value of the dollar against the closest thing I can find to a gold-based currency. And one of the things that the Russians did back in 2014 when all this Euromaidan stuff started happening is they started buying up gold and binding their economy to the to the gold standard. They didn't do quite the gold standard because they didn't have enough gold. They bound it to, you know, gold and oil and various other commodities. But it's a hard backed currency, unlike ours, which the American dollar is backed by faith unicorns and aircraft carriers. And one of the consequences that we're going to have, like with the Houthis blowing up ships, you know, the value of aircraft carriers don't seem to be, you know, aircraft carriers don't seem to be quite as impressive as they used to be. And eventually, when Russia eventually wins the Ukraine war, which yes, they're eventually going to win, that's going to have an adverse effect on the American dollar because our dollar is backed by our military might because we outsourced all of our manufacturing overseas decades ago when I was a kid. That's why we don't have lots of high-paying manufacturing jobs, and why you have all these ghost towns in like Appalachia, and you know, you go through Pennsylvania, you see all these abandoned factories and stuff. So and that's why they call it the Rust Belt. And we'll bring some of that back, and it'll be interesting to see what happens if we can. So Trump's plan is he's trying to grow the economy faster than we spend ourselves into oblivion. But I don't know if that's possible. I mean, it's the only strategy we have. It's the only thing we can do. Because our Congress isn't going to cut spending. The Democrats and the Republicans are too tied to the spending bills. Because for example, Tom Cole, my rep here in Oklahoma, we have Tinker Air Force Base, and Tinker Air Force Base adds a lot of money to the Oklahoma economy, right? And so Oklahoma is, one of the reasons he keeps getting reelected is because he's really good at bringing that money into Oklahoma, right? Bring that federal money in. The problem is, where does that federal money come from? Federal money comes from the magic printing machines that magically print money, and at some point, the bubble's going to pop. So, and then you also have a problem with the Federal Reserve doesn't want to lower inflation or doesn't want to lower interest rates. Now, they say it's because they don't want there to be inflation. Normally, when the economy's too hot, the Federal Reserve is supposed to raise interest rates to cool down the economy. That way, it's more expensive for people to borrow money, and so they don't take as many investment risks, and it kind of slows the growth down. So you want the economy to grow at a controlled rate. You don't want just out of control growth, because then you have bubbles that eventually burst. The problem is because of the bad economy under Biden, because of COVID, because of a lot of reasons, Americans have huge amounts of debt. And by having the higher interest rates, Americans are paying more money to service that debt. The American government's paying more money to service that debt. And if people were earning more money, if the economy gets super hot, you're not going to have inflation, because people are going to take that extra money and they're going to pay down their debt. Remember what I said earlier, where if I give you a dollar, if I buy something from you and then you spend that dollar on somebody else, and so on, that dollar's in circulation 10, 20 times, and that's going to make the economy really hot. But if I buy something from you with that dollar and you use that dollar to go pay off your debt, now that dollar's out of the economy again, and the economy cools off. And so until we get our debts paid off, the lower interest rates really won't heat up the economy, because we're just going to be spending the surplus. Normal Americans will spend that surplus to pay off debt. Now, the government should also use their surplus to pay off debt, but they're not going to do that because, because they can kick the can down the road. The politicians only care about getting elected, and then by the time they retire, the economy's not going to implode under Trump's administration. And it may not even implode under the next guy. It may still be 10 years. The American government's very good at kicking the can down the road, but at some point it's going to, if we don't get this debt paid off, it's going to eventually implode. Our credit rating as a country keeps getting downgraded, which means that it costs us more and more money just to borrow money. The interest rates that we have to pay keep getting higher as our credit rating goes down. It's the same thing when you have a credit card or bank loan. If you've got amazing credit, these billionaires with amazing credit can borrow huge amounts of money at like 1%, 2%, 3% interest, because they're billionaires, they've got amazing credit. Whereas if you or I try and take out a credit card, we're paying 30% because fuck us. We're little people. Right now, the American government used to have the highest credit score possible in all of humanity. And now it's been downgraded again recently. It was downgraded once before when I was younger, maybe 10 years ago. It's been downgraded again. It might have been downgraded a couple times that I didn't notice. But we're still a better credit risk than most anybody else. But if we ever lose the world's reserve currency status, as people start moving away from the US dollar, then our credit rating will continue to drop. It'll start costing us more and more money to borrow. For example, Greece had a big debt problem because their economy sucked, their credit rating sucked, nobody wanted to lend them money, and then they were forced into all kinds of austerity measures, which caused riots and all kinds of problems. It was a mess. And Now, the Greeks kind of like to take a riot day so they can go to the beach. A couple people riot, everybody else goes to the beach. It's sort of a free day off of work. But, you know, that could happen here, and at some point, the bottom's going to fall out. Now, what am I going to do if there's lots of, when the bottom falls out, you're going to see explosive inflation, kind of like what you saw under COVID. And, one of the nice things about owning a business is I can just raise my prices. As money becomes worth less and less, as I have to pay my employees more and more, as parts and supplies cost more, I'll just raise my prices and pass the cost off to the customers, right? That's why everything keeps getting more expensive. But there's always a delay between when prices go up and when you get paid more. Even with my business, when we raised our prices, I raised my prices a couple months before I started paying the guys more because I wanted to make sure that the new pricing structure would hold. And so every time I raised the prices, the employees would see a pay raise maybe a couple months later, but there's always a delay. Now, in my case, because I'm a small business and I really love the guys that work for me, I raise their paychecks as fast as I can. In a bigger company like Walmart, who doesn't give a crap about their employees, they're going to raise their prices and you're going to still get paid the same because screw you, they don't care. So, what can you do about it? Well, a lot of people pump money into the stock market. They're always talking about, oh, look, the stock market's so great, it keeps getting higher and higher and higher. Well, the reason it's getting higher and higher is because nobody has a place to put their money. But the stock market, companies are being valued way above what they really are. I think the stock market's at a bubble. I think, when you saw some of the stock market crashing down, I think that was just a reset where it's trying to rebalance itself. And yes, the stock prices should go up and should generally match inflation. But here's the thing. The American economy is not expanding as fast as our money supply is. So whenever you have money, whenever you're printing money faster than the rate at which you are growing the economy, that's when you have inflation, right? So the stock market's the stock market's supposed to represent the economic might of the companies involved, but the stock market is inflating faster than the companies are as well. So I think that's probably a bit of a bubble. Now, you've got crypto. Crypto's probably a good investment because that's you're sort of hedging your bet against the government. The decentralized crypto like Bitcoin and Ethereum and some of those. And I know a lot of people are doing research on that. I personally don't have any crypto. If I had extra money, I probably would buy some. I see crypto more as a convenient way to pay people overseas, where I can buy some Bitcoin, pay somebody with it, and it's just a fast way to transfer money and pay people. What I'm personally doing is I'm investing any spare money I have into growing my business. We're doing some remodeling where we've expanded our space. We're, looking at bringing on a new sales rep and things like that. And so I'm investing into stuff that I have control over because what I'm hoping is that in the future, as there's inflation, I can just keep raising prices to match. And if I can grow my business, then that'll do well for me, because that's something I've always felt that you should invest in something that you either know a lot about or something that you have control over. I personally think everybody should have their own side gig at least. Even if you work for somebody else, you should have a little side gig where you can make some money. That you're in control over. Kind of like mowing lawns as a kid. Actually, mowing lawns can be a good business. A lot of people need their lawns mowed, especially if all the illegals get deported. Then mowing lawns might be pretty profitable, actually. But I would find what I personally do is I try to learn some new skills. And I spend a little bit of time each day learning new skills. And I spend a little bit of time doing something that's got a long-term benefit, and something, in my case, it's mostly investing in my business. And especially if it's something where I can put in effort rather than money. If I can spend my effort to grow the business, then I can see a return on the effort that I'm putting in. And so I think that that's a good way to prepare, because when you're in control over your own income, then it's a lot easier to adapt to whatever's happening. And then, my dad would tell you to buy investment tangibles, buy tangible assets, gold and real estate and things that are physically there, right? Um, something that will hold value that you can then, that, for example, gold's at what, like over $3,000 an ounce now, and gold is kind of hedging your bet against the U.S. dollar, because there's only so much gold on the planet. So that's a, that's a, find something that you know about that you can put your money in. But just putting the money in the bank and collecting your 1% interest or whatnot, inflation's, they say it's down to 2% right now. I don't believe it. I think it's probably still 5-10%. Um, you want to find something that's going to outperform inflation, and that's always the hard part. And also, it's hard to be taxed on your own effort. If you're doing something that produces money, the government's going to take its cut. But if you're doing something that makes your life more efficient or that builds towards the future, money that you're investing in your businesses, you can write that off. Your taxes, the government only taxes you on your net, income. So um, that's one of the other reasons that I think it's good to start a side business, not just for the control, but also for the for the tax implications. And you'll want to talk to an accountant about that. I'm not going to claim to be an expert on that, but in general, money that you're investing into your business, you can write off of your taxes. You can expense it. So ultimately, invest in yourself. Invest in your health, your energy, your intellect, because that's how you're going to be able. They can't take away those things. But I think that probably sometime in the next, probably within 10 years, uh, unless unless they just have continued optimism in America. Now, one thing that is good, with Trump getting all these investments, these foreign investors investing in America, that is going to build optimism, and that will allow us to kick the can down the road, probably for a few more years. But that can only go so far. You can only borrow so much, and at some point it's going to happen, and the U.S. government can't go bankrupt. They're gonna have to pay it off one way or another, which means either selling assets, which we don't want to do. You don't want to sell the national parks to private investors. That's going to suck, because then we'll lose our national parks. Um, you don't want to sell off aircraft carriers and things like that. Realistically, they're just going to print lots of money and you'll have massive inflation. That's what they did in Weimar Germany before World War II. That's what pretty much every government does, because there'd be whichever politician voted to sell off a national park would never get reelected. And, they'd probably get, you'd have torches and pitchforks in the street. So they're just going to go print more money, because that's the secret tax on the poor people. And as long and you hedge your bet on that by owning stuff that goes up in value. My house is worth one house regardless of how much the money is. And over the years, my house has probably doubled in value just because of inflation, even though the house is still my house. So those are kind of my thoughts for the day. I'm going to probably head off to the office here in a little bit. I've got to do a meeting here in about 3 hours. I want some time to prepare for it. But I don't think there's going to be a civil war, Shadow Wolf. I mean, Well, let me qualify that. I don't think there's going to be a civil war because of inflation. If you have, if they bankrupt the country, you might have a revolution. But a civil war is where one group of people fights, and where two sides fight each other. For example, you could say that in in 2020, when you had the contested election, when you had the Black Lives Matter fiery but mostly peaceful protests in the street, and you had the beatings in Portland, the Proud Boys versus Antifa. That was more like Civil War stuff. What didn't quite get to the Civil War, I think they called it civil strife or whatnot. But you had two groups of people with different political ideologies. A revolution be more like in France when the government fucked up and everybody got mad. You had all the people come together and overthrow the government. Or in 1776 when the Brits were taxing us without representation, trying to take away our guns, we kicked the government out and formed a new one. So I think you might have a revolution, but probably not a civil war. I know it's a very nuanced difference, but you raise a good point. Um, I'm hoping that we can avoid all that, and like I said, I don't think it's going to happen for a while. I do think that it's a good idea to be in shape and be as self-sufficient as possible. I'm not going to grow my own food. I suck at it. I've tried it. I'm no good at gardening. My plan is to have useful skills that I can then barter to people who are good at growing food. Fortunately, I live in Oklahoma. I have some nice customers who have farms and ranches, and we can trade services. I can buy stuff directly from them. So, but you want to have something that's of value. Being a barista at Starbucks does not have any intrinsic value. No offense to the people who work at Starbucks. Being a cashier at Walmart does not have any intrinsic value. Being an electrical engineer and knowing how to wire stuff up, or being an auto mechanic and knowing how to fix cars, knowing how to do something important that's necessary in a survival situation, that has value. You can barter that, you can trade that, right? Or just owning property. If things get bad, you own a house and you have your five buddies with all their guns hang out with you, and you have your little piece of the world. And that's one of the other things that's going to be a problem. Is like, I don't know how younger people are going to be able to buy property. I know when I bought my house, I was barely able to do it. I had to get some shit loan that ended up screwing me. I had to have my mom co-sign for me because I was just some college kid. And when you're self-employed, it's hard to. I would buy the house before you become self-employed because the whole system is designed to discourage you from being self-employed and independent. They want you to be somebody else's bitch. So, but having my own house means I don't have to worry about being homeless because my bullshit landlord is trying to do something. I got evicted from my apartment once, not because I was late on rent or anything bad. It's just the landlord sold the apartment, and the new landlord was like, "Up, I'm gonna renovate. You've got a month to get out." And I hadn't closed on my house yet, and so I ended up living in the back of the store for a couple months till I closed on my house. So, but I do. I'm a traditionalist. I think that everybody should have the means to defend themselves. You take that however you want to take that. But I think that you should be in as much control of your destiny as you can, and that's how you deal with economic problems. I think that whether you like him or not, Trump is going to allow the can to be kicked down the road longer than we would have had if, say, Biden had come back in, or if we'd gotten Kamala, because just Trump's ability to get foreign investment into America that Biden and Kamala do not have, That's going to buy us a little bit of time, right? And do I think that Congress is going to ever get the spending under control? No. No, I don't. There's no incentive for them to do so. I think that they're going to get their donors rich. They're going to end up getting some book deal and getting rich. They're going to invest all their ill-gotten gains into something that'll survive the economic collapse. And then when the economy falls apart, it's going to be the next guy's problem. That's how politics works. So we're going to have to figure it out for ourselves. And it's going to be especially hard for the younger people. I mean, I'm really fortunate. I own my business. I get to play video games a few hours each day. Sometimes I get really busy, and I work like 12 hours a day. But I get to do what I want to do when I want to do it. And that's one of the reasons I do some of these streams. I want to help you guys get to that point. Look, I'm not going to teach you how to become a billionaire. I've never been a billionaire. I don't know how to do it, right? I mean, from what I've seen, the easiest way to become a billionaire is to launder a bunch of other people's money. Maybe someday I'll decide to get rich and I'll run for office and I'll get my book deal and but unless you invent or create something that everybody wants, it's very hard to get filthy, stinking rich. Look at the big tech billionaires. I mean, yeah, everybody likes Facebook, but let's face it, Zuck kind of zucked some people on his way to the top, right? Elon's doing awesome things for the planet, but he also had big government contracts kind of help him get there. Frankly, I think that one of the reasons Elon went all in for Trump is because he and Biden had gotten into some pissy fights with each other, and I think Elon figured that the Trump government would be more favorable to him than a Biden government. These are the kinds of things that happen on that high-end scale, and I'm no good at playing politics. I don't have the patience for it. Now I can teach you how to become a millionaire. Everybody can become a millionaire. That's a lot easier. Just make a good business and invest wisely. Don't screw up. Be smart enough and make good decisions, and then just keep at it. And that will get you there over time. But it's a very long journey. And then avoid the big mistakes. In the woods with my dog. Well, my dog died, but up until that point, I had that, right? So I mean, I've achieved most of what I want to do in life, and I can teach you how to do that. And that's what I hope. I can help people become independent so you can live life. I want to live life by my own rules, right? And I want you guys to be able to do that too. And one of the reasons I talk about economics, even though this is primarily a gaming channel, is, the reason I can play the video games is because I understand the economics and I can make the money coming in to where I can afford to do that. Because I don't have any, big gaming sponsors, nor do I particularly want any of that. So I'm going to get ready for work. If you guys have any questions, hit me up on Discord. And I'm happy to sit down and talk to you about your skills and help you figure out something that you can do to get some side cash. And then that's how I got my computer store going. I was making some money on the side. I was working for Gateway at the time. I was fixing computers out of my apartment with my college buddies. And the money that I made, the Gateway job paid the bills, and the money I made fixing computers on the side, I reinvested in the business, and that's how I did it. That's how I got started. So, anyway, I hope this is helpful, and let me know if you like these little lunch break things. I don't mind doing them when I have the time. I'm going to go head into the office, and I will see you guys later. Thanks for hanging out.